Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to the BIS. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to say a special hello to someone from Australia who I believe has joined us, and it's about, what, 5 o'clock in the morning or something like, or got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And his name is Nathan. So welcome Nathan, thanks for being here, and hello from the BIS across the world. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Jerry Stone, who most of you will know very well. But Jerry is a spaceflight and astronomy presenter and a council member at the BIS. So over to you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will just add to that I am the person who's given the most presentations at the British Interplanetary Society. And beyond that, I discovered recently that I've actually been giving presentations on astronomy and space exploration for longer than Patrick Moore presented the sky at night. And that sort of makes me feel a bit old. Anyway, no. So tonight's presentation is entitled Nell, Esther and Aunt Effie, and I'll be explaining the names of the three ladies. But before we get into that, just a bit of housekeeping. Welcome to everybody here. If you haven't been to one of our meetings before, do come and say hello to someone at some time. We're not expecting an alarm to go off, but if it should happen, make your way to the exit at the front of the building, unless, of course, that's where the problem is, in which case go to the rear exit. Then go along the main road to the corner of the park where we'll check you off the attendance list. If you're too hot or too cold, then do let us know. Toilets are available just around the corner or upstairs for ladies. Please put your phones and cameras in silent mode, but you don't have to switch them off, because you're welcome to send posts telling other people what a grand time they are missing and that they should have been here. You can also take photos, that's okay, but please don't use flash. So, on to today's event. So, as I said, we have three women's names. I decided not to call it the launch of the world's first liquid fuel rocket. You know, you want to attract the attention of the audience. But the main man in question is, of course, Robert Hutchings Goddard, who was born on the 5th of October 1882 in the eastern state of Massachusetts, in the town of Worcester, in the suburb of Auburn, at number 1 Tullawanda Drive, in an area called Maple Hill. So this is the family home, though at the time the area was much more rural, with very few other houses. Shortly after his birth, the family moved to Boston, and with a curiosity about nature, he studied the heavens using a telescope given to him by his father, and he observed birds flying. In 1898, his mother contracted tuberculosis, and the family moved back from Boston, where they had gone to Worcester for the clearer air. Now, we're talking about over 100 years ago, you know, and Boston was already not as clean as other places. So Goddard became a theoretical scientist as well as a practical engineer. His dream was the conquest of the upper atmosphere and ultimately space through the use of rocket propulsion. Among his many patents, two very important ones were granted in 1914 when he was 35. They were for a liquid-fueled rocket and a multi-stage rocket. Exactly what was used to send the Apollo astronauts to the moon and what SpaceX, Blue Origin and every other company and indeed every other country around the world does today. With the electrification of American cities in the 1880s, young Goddard became interested in science, specifically engineering and technology. He was encouraged by his father, who not only gave him the telescope, but also a microscope and, very importantly, a subscription to Scientific American. So he became interested in space at the age of 16 when he read H.G. Wells' newly published novel, The War of the Worlds. But he was, when he was young, thin and frail, almost always in fragile health, and he fell 2 years behind his classmates. But he became a very voracious reader, regularly visiting the local public library to borrow books on the physical sciences. But one book that was published 5 years later, in 1903, would most likely not have found its way to the library, the reason being that it was published in Russia. It was titled Exploration of Outer Space by Means of Rocket Devices and was written by a self-taught deaf schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, in which he described liquid fuel rockets, and among his works he also produced designs for rocket with steering thrusters, multi-stage boosters, space stations, airlocks for exiting a spaceship to the vacuum of space, and closed-cycle biological systems to provide food and oxygen for space colonies. So he's considered one of the fathers of spaceflight and the first person to conceive the space elevator, becoming inspired in 1895 by the newly constructed Eiffel Tower in Paris. Well, in 1899, a 17-year-old Goddard had a vision that altered his life, and it was due to his imagination. In 1927, he wrote material for an autobiography and said, "On the afternoon of October 19th, 1899, I climbed a tall cherry tree at the back of the barn, similar to this one, and armed with a saw and a hatchet started to trim the dead leaves from the cherry tree." He wrote, "It was one of the quiet, colourful afternoons of sheer beauty that we have in October in New England. And as I looked towards the fields at the east, I imagined how wonderful it would be to make some device which had even the possibility of ascending to Mars, and how it would look on a small scale if sent up from the meadow at my feet." So in any event, he said, "I was a different boy when I descended from the tree, from when I ascended, for existence at last seemed very purposeful." So October 19th was of such significance to Goddard that he christened it his anniversary day and made some reference to it in his diary almost every year. Unfortunately, in 1938, the tree was lost in a storm, and on that day, in his diary, Goddard wrote, "Tree destroyed, must go on alone." So he built and launched solid fuel rockets locally across the Coes Reservoir, and he and other Americans had a great advantage over people in the UK. We weren't allowed to build and launch rockets, as we were under the restrictions of the Explosives Act of 1875, which regulated the manufacture, storage, sale and transport of explosives such as gunpowder. And this was only partly repealed in 1974. As I said, illness affected his schooling on and off, but he studied at the old South High School in Worcester and then went to Worcester Polytechnic up in the north there. He first obtained public notice in 1907 from a cloud of smoke from a powder rocket fired in the basement of the Institute's physics building. School officials took an immediate interest in the work of their student, and the administration, to their credit, did not expel him, but arranged for his experiments to be carried out under safe conditions. So while still an undergraduate, he wrote a paper proposing a method for balancing aeroplanes and submitted the idea to Scientific American, which published the paper in 1907. He later wrote in his diaries that he believed this paper was the first proposal of a way to stabilize aircraft in flight. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in physics from Worcester Polytechnic in 1908 and then enrolled at Clark University. His first writing on the possibility of a liquid fuel rocket came in February 1909. Goddard had begun to study ways of increasing a rocket's energy efficiency using methods alternative to conventional powder rockets. He wrote in his journal about an idea of using liquid hydrogen as a fuel with liquid oxygen as the oxidizer, which some 60 years later was used in the upper stages of the Saturn V rocket. He believed a 50% efficiency could be achieved with liquid fuel, much greater than that of conventional rockets. He finished graduate school at Clark with an MA in General Sciences in 1910 and completed his PhD in 1911. That's pretty fast work. He then spent another year at Clark as an honorary fellow of physics, and in 1912 he accepted a research fellowship at Princeton University's Palmer Physical Laboratory. Now, in 1912, while working at Princeton, he investigated the effects of radio waves on insulators. In order to generate radio frequency power, he invented a vacuum tube with a beam deflection that operated like a cathode ray oscillator tube, and his patent on this tube predates that of the electronics pioneer Lee DeForest. Now, incidentally, many of you may know that Star Trek's Dr. McCoy, played by DeForest Kelley, he was actually named after Lee DeForest.